We don't sit as quickly as we used to.
Yeah. Tell me about it.
Can you guys take it from here? Welcome to the 92nd Street Y. There are many topics for us to get to, and then your questions. I want to start with August 27th, 1963. It's the night before. Where are you, and what is going through your mind? Clarence, let's start with you.
August 27th, 1963. I am at the Willard Hotel. I am there contemplating about tomorrow, but more specifically, is that Dr. King and Mrs. King, they're upstairs in a suite at the Willard Hotel. And during the previous 2 or 3 weeks, as the march approached, Dr. King had not only discussed with one of his very close personal advisors, Stanley Levison, and a person like Cleveland Robinson, labor leader, and discussed with me what he might consider saying. And he had been offered a lot of different advice between that time and August 27th. During part of the evening, Cleveland Robinson, Professor Lawrence Reddick, Ralph Abernathy, and myself, and Walter Fauntleroy, we were at the Willard Hotel. And there came a time when I called Dr. King and I said, you know, your colleagues are here, including myself, and they just want to have a last-minute conversation with you. So he came down, gave the bellman $10 or $20 to rope off a little corner of the hotel. And I had extensive conversations with him singly and along with Stanley Levison about what he might consider saying on that day. But the others really wanted to have a chance to sort of have their last input. So I was sitting around, and Ralph Abernathy, I remember him saying, you know, Martin, these people tomorrow, they're coming all this distance. They're coming to hear you preach. And Lawrence Reddick said, well, I don't know about that. A lot of people have heard you preach before, Martin. They don't. They think they want to hear you say something substantively. And Cleveland Robinson, who was like 6'2", labor leader, partially blind, had a booming voice. He says, yes, we have some political leadership and so forth. And back and forth. And then as we were having this discussion, Martin said, have you taking notes, Clarence? And I said, yeah, I'm taking some notes. So he says, why don't you go upstairs for a minute or go somewhere and just summarize what everybody has said? So I did that for about 20, 30 minutes, and I come back. And I start to read the summary of what I thought everybody had said. And I don't think I got more than 45 seconds or 60 seconds out of it. And somebody interrupted me. I'm not sure who it was, but somebody, it may have been Ralph, and said, well, I thought, what kind of lawyer are you? You can't even take down notes accurately, you know? And I was reporting, and everybody was criticizing me for not accurately reporting what I heard them say, okay? Martin had this look of exasperation. He got up and he said, thank you, everyone. He said, I'm going upstairs with Coretta and finish my speech and counsel with the Lord. Clarence, I'll talk to you in the morning, and hand me whatever notes you had. Now, I had prepared a summary on yellow sheets of paper of some suggested texts that he might consider. Not that, you know, I have to make this. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote all of his sermons are his sermons. Right. All of his speeches were principally his speeches. But with the press of time and so forth, he couldn't do everything, and he would rely principally on Stanley Levison and myself. So I drafted something for him to consider using. And little did I know, until I heard him actually speak the next day, that indeed he used part of it.
That's a pretty good moment. Julian, where were you? And was there a sense the night before of, oh, this is going to be the greatest, or is there concern that it may not go so well?
I really can't remember where I spent the night. I had driven from Atlanta, where I lived at the time, with 6 or 7 other people in a borrowed car. We got to Washington. We stayed at someone's home. I don't remember whose home that was. We couldn't afford hotels. And we really were of mixed mind about it in my organization. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was my organization. And we were, on the one hand, thought this was a diversion from what we were doing. We thought of ourselves as organizers. We were organizing in the rural South, and we didn't have time to come up to Washington and march someplace. On the other hand, all of the civil rights organizations had agreed to support this. All of their leadership was there. My leadership, John Lewis, was going to be one of the principal speakers. And I had been assigned by my organization to work at the march, as each organization had assigned other people. So I spent the night before, I think, with colleagues, thinking about what tomorrow might be, but having no real idea of what it would happen, and really being divided about what this thing would be and what it would mean. I remember, I think, seeing Malcolm X in one of the hotels there. He had come to watch this, and he became a tremendous critic of the march.
You called it the farce on Washington.
Yes. And I remember seeing him, but not speaking to him or talking to him at all, but just saying, ooh, that's Malcolm X.
Harry, you were in charge of getting celebrities. One of the things that Dr. King had asked you to do was get celebrities to come and be part of this. And you were on the flight from Los Angeles with Marlon Brando and Charlton Heston and many others. Did you get there the night before? And again, what's the atmosphere like on that plane on the eve of what we now know as an historic event? But at that time, what was the feeling?
I think that there was a great deal of anxiety about the success of the event. We had no idea that such an inordinate number of Americans would show up. And we were quite anxious to see how the following day would turn out. So we spent a lot of time discussing the pros and cons of the event. One of the things I think it's important to note was that the Kennedys had very much against the idea of the march. And they had been, in part, instructed by J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI, that they could expect that this event would erupt into some of the greatest violence America had ever known, that the event could not be trusted, and certainly those who put the event together could not be trusted. And one of the things in inviting celebrities wasn't just for the display of celebrity, it was because it was to help assuage the fears that the Kennedys had, that there would not be a peaceful assembly. And one of the things that we achieved in inviting all of these celebrities to come was to kind of underscore the fact that this was not filled with the villainy that they expected, that there'd be thugs and all sorts of disgruntled people showing up, making mayhem and mischief. And the presence of these celebrities, I had flown in from California with the California delegation, although I had the responsibility of not only recruiting those who came from California, but also a large group that came from New York. So several plays on Broadway had shut down for the day. And that delegation arrived most of that evening, and I was very busy checking billets and make sure that everyone arrived. And some came the following morning. So I was very busy making sure that everybody was comfortable and had not so much instructions, but to have answers to questions they would raise as to the event and what would be expected of them.
Names are not important, but are there people who you approached to be part of it, who, for whatever reason, said, I'd love to, but I just can't, and then were regretful about that after the fact?
Yes, there were a number who were quite fearful of the event, not just from the idea that it could be violent. More importantly, many of them felt that this could affect their careers, that to be a part of this movement with the McCarthyism kind of flavor in the air. We were all branded as communists and traitors to America, and that our movement was being pushed by foreign powers, mostly the Soviet Union, and that all of these conspirators were now assembled in this place. But many have since, or at least right after that event, expressed their great regret that they had not been more courageous and more believing in that the event would have been what it turned out to be.
Let me tell you about the details of what the city of D.C. and the Kennedy administration did to ensure that the violence they expected would be kept under control. All elective surgery in the area's hospitals were canceled, freeing 350 beds for riot-related emergencies. 1,900 of Washington's police officers worked 18-hour overtime shifts. Police plotted 72 potential disaster scenarios and planned a response to each one. In the event of a riot, a policeman or National Guardsman would be stationed on every street corner in downtown Washington's business district. They deployed 200 scout cars, 86 motorcycles, 20 jeeps, several police helicopters, 23 cranes to remove broken down or disabled buses. Judges were placed on around-the-clock standby. 350 inmates were evacuated from the district's jail to create space for disruptive protesters. 2,400 National Guardsmen were sworn in as special officers and given temporary arrest powers. Government offices were shut down. This is so telling. Liquor sales were banned for the first time since Prohibition. On the day of the march, the District of Columbia was placed under virtual martial law. Kennedy ordered the biggest peacetime military buildup in American history. 5 military bases on the Capitol's outskirts were bursting with activity. A heavily armed 4,000-strong task force prepared for distribution. At Fort Myer, Fort Belvoir, Fort Meade, Quantico Marine Base, and the Anacostia Naval Station, 300 helicopters were flown in to provide airlift capacity. At Fort Bragg, North Carolina, 15,000 Special Forces troops were placed on standby. 150 FBI agents were assigned to mingle with the crowds. Here's a good point. Missing from this human and mechanical arsenal were police dogs. Washington's 69 police dogs remained in their kennels at the orders of Robert Kennedy to avoid a repetition of the ugly image of Birmingham. And Washington canceled its long-standing policy of allowing white officers to bar black policemen from their squad cars. And the administration stationed an official just off the right of the Lincoln Memorial with a cutoff slip and a record turntable. If militant protesters overran the speaker's platform, a sound feed to the loudspeakers would be cut off and replaced by a recording of Mahalia Jackson singing, "He's Got the Whole World in His Hand."
Now Julian gave an excellent summary of what was going on outside the response to the march. And I'm sorry that my friend John Lewis isn't here because there were three controversies around the march that most of the public only knew about one or two of them. The most prominent one, of course, involving John Lewis himself, in which he had, he was chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and he had written a speech as one of the leaders of the coordinating organizations that he felt fully reflected the way his organization felt at that time. And there was a controversial reference about if something didn't happen, if they didn't grant what we're asking, we would be marching through Georgia like Sherman marched through Georgia. Right. And this was considered to be very provocative. And Archbishop O'Boyle, one of the important participants in the march, head of the Catholic Archdiocese in Washington, D.C., insisted that unless that language was changed, he was going to not give the invocation, he was going to pull out his support. And so the effort was how to persuade the young John Lewis to change. And it was, nobody had the credentials to do that except one man, and that was A. Philip Randolph. And A. Philip Randolph got him to change a language that was deemed suitable. And he gave a very powerful speech at the march, if you can recall. The other controversy was not generally known was, and the march was being organized, who was going to be like the march's chief of staff. And the person who had the most talent for organization was Bayard Rustin. And Bayard Rustin had the support of Dr. King and had the support of A. Philip Randolph. But Bayard, he was gay. And for those of us who knew him, he was gay. But he also had a record of a conviction for a homosexual activity in Pasadena, and it was on his criminal record. And those who opposed him being the chief of staff, they used this as a basis for saying under no circumstances can Bayard Rustin be the chief of staff. And I remember sitting in this meeting and listening, and I knew exactly how A. Philip Randolph felt, and I knew that he had the support of Dr. King. And Dr. King finally said, well, let he who has not sinned come forward and cast the first stone. You know? And there was silence. Now the third controversy involved the order of speaking. It was decided that there were going to be 10 speakers, and that each speaker was going to only have about 5 minutes each. And somehow, I don't know where it came from, but I perceived, and A. Philip Randolph brought this to my attention, Bayard Rustin, that there was a group of ministers and other people who recommended that Dr. King be like the 5th or 6th speaker, that he not be the last speaker. And I heard about this, and I discussed it with Bayard, and Dr. King, who would come to the meetings when he could, but this was one meeting where he really wanted to come, and I said, no, Martin, I don't want you to come to this meeting. So I'm sitting in the meeting, and I'm listening to all the reasons why so-and-so should speak first, second, and third, and yes, Dr. King should speak in the middle, 5th. And I said, a number of people, he had people in the room too who said, I think a number of people are coming here to hear Dr. King speak. Well, he's not the only person speaking. And I said, yes. And I listened. And so finally, when the discussion got somewhat acrimonious, I said, listen, excuse me. I assume everybody in this room has heard Dr. King speak. Oh, yes, Attorney Jones, yes. I said, do you really want to follow him? Do you really want to follow him? And it was dead silence. And then A. Philip Randolph says, well, yes, I guess Brother Jones makes a good point. So Dr. King is going to be the last speaker. And you go and you tell Dr. King this, and as I'm leaving, A. Philip Randolph leans over in my ear and says, when you see Martin, you tell him he's the last speaker. He can take as much time as he needs.
We think, when we read about this day, and the movement in general, it's historic, it's serious, obviously, a seriousness of purpose. Are there moments of humor? Are there fun moments that you recall from that day? Little things that happen that are away from the limelight. Obviously, the speech is front and center, and the John Lewis story as well. But are there little moments that you experienced that you think back on it, that are personal moments that make you laugh?
As I said, each of the civil rights organizations sponsoring the march was asked to contribute staff people to the march. And I was one of the people contributed for mine. I worked for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. We were the youngest, the biggest, and the baddest, all the groups. And I had 2 tasks. One was distributing John Lewis's speech to the journalists. And I don't know if you look at the Lincoln Memorial, the journalists were about on the second row of seats. and on chairs, and I had to pass out this speech to them. And John, I'd looked at John's speech, and he was the only speaker that day to say black people instead of Negroes or colored people. And I wanted to point this out to the journalists because I thought it would demonstrate how militant we were and how superior to everyone else. So I went down the row of these people and said, look at this, look at this. Nobody paid any attention. But for me, and I had heard Dr. King speak many times and thought he gave a wonderful, wonderful speech. But one of the high points for me was I also had the job of giving Coca-Colas to the movie stars. And I remember giving a Coca-Cola to Sammy Davis Jr., and he said, thanks, kid.
And yet somehow when the history is told, they lead with the speech.
Indeed, yes.
How is that possible?
A mystery.
Your friends, your colleagues come from California and New York to be part of this as the day is going on. And you walk through the crowd, I believe, or at least that's what I've read, that some of them walk through the crowds at a certain point. Are there little things that you pick up on and how they're responding, these people that you're in charge of, that kind of you remember all these years later?
Well, the profession to which I belong is nurtured by fierce egos and deep, deep narcissism. And usually when you see large gatherings of celebrities, there is a certain air about the way in which they do their thing. And what fascinated me was that in the first instance, the expression en masse with this group was that they felt very disoriented. There was nothing here that they could be ascribed as familiar to them. There were some who had been to rallies and had done individual events. Through the years of working with Dr. King, I had to call upon some of them from time to time to fill a stadium or to fill an auditorium and use their celebrity presence to help draw a crowd that might have been otherwise resistant to coming just to hear Dr. King. And but here in this place, they looked around for where to position themselves and feel comforted. And there was no place for them to go. They were thrown in with a lot of bus drivers and taxi drivers and a lot of maids and students and people who came with us with a movement mission. And eventually you saw a transformation. I looked over and see Marlon holding court with a small group of people, speaking of his experiences. And he had brought with him, I don't know what he thought he was going to do with it, but he brought with him an electric cattle prod that had been used by the Southern police to move picketers along and to move people who resisted. And he came to demonstrate to these people the cruelty of what the opposition was doing. And I at one point said to Marlon, Marlon, I'm very happy that you're explaining all of this, but these are the people who are the recipients of that pride. They know more about it than you do. But by and large, the overall group became very caught up in the spirit of the day and the spirit of the moment. And as speeches began to take place, not just Dr. King's speech, there were several speakers who spoke that day that spoke passionately and with great reverence to our movement and to our cause. And all of these celebrities lost their narcissistic edge. Their egos lowered its, yes, sir.
let me just say something. My brother is being, he's giving an accurate picture, but he's being far too modest. So he can't say what I'm going to say about the celebrity delegation. This is 1963, all right? Harry Belafonte is at the top of his game. Do you hear what I'm saying?
I believe I do.
People in the entertainment business, in Hollywood, they knew his relationship with Martin Luther King Jr. They knew that. He was very close, all right? He is probably the only artist in America at that time who could have put that celebrity delegation together. Now, he looks at it. Let me tell you what the real facts are, okay?
I'm a journalist. Real facts have nothing to do with this story.
No. These artists with great egos, okay? They were like intimidated. When Harry spoke to them, excuse me, nobody said no to him, okay? And he had such power and respect over them that he could assemble these artists. And but the thing most extraordinary thing is, I don't know how it came to pass, but he said to me, he says, Clarence, Charlton Heston is the chairman of the celebrity delegation. And you may not remember, but he says, you have to be at a certain place because I want you to help me lead them to a certain place to sit on the podium. Harry and his publicist knew the American mentality. He knew that if the group of celebrities sat in a certain place on the podium where the cameras they would pan on the celebrities, but they would unavoidably have to see the other people on the platform.
Wasn't it
Okay?
Dr. King who said wanted you to get Charlton Heston because he wanted people across the political divide?
Right.
Yes. When I submitted to him the list that we had put together, and by that time, when I gave him the final list, most of them had all said they would come. He looked and he said, where's the opposition? I said, well, why do you expect that the opposition would come? He said, because that's your task to make sure they do. And the only way I could kind of embrace that charge, that responsibility, was to go to Charlton Heston. And when I asked Mr. Heston about coming, he said, I don't think we should be discussing this on the phone. So I went to his home, and we had our conversation, and I described the event, and I described what it was that I thought we were going to achieve, or certainly the goals that we had set for ourselves. The thing that I think that most convinced Charlton Heston to come was that he was as powerful a star as he was from the box office perspective. He always felt somehow that Hollywood never saw him as part of the elite of the art of acting, that he was a facade, a profile, but he didn't have the image of Marlon Brando and Paul Newman. And for the idea, which I kind of dangled before him, that he would be a leader for this group of very distinguished actors and guys who had great rep as fine actors and whatnot, kind of made him feel like, at last I'm part of the in crowd. And I think he was convinced that with Burt Lancaster and that the level of artists that had responded to coming, Robert Ryan and so many others, that he felt comfortable with the fact that beyond just being the opposition, that he was now going to be identified from that moment on as one of the great actors in the picture business. And I thought he was correct. because he certainly acted as if he was comfortable.
There is no questioning this gentleman's bona fides in terms of his involvement in the movement, but for the SNCC kids at that moment, seeing these people, and I don't want to make this too much about these celebrities that came from New York and LA to be part of this, because obviously the story is much bigger than that. For the SNCC kids who were out there on the front lines, was there a feeling of, okay, we need this, this is one way that the story gets told, or is there a feeling that day of, hey, wait a minute, we're getting you-know-what kicked out of us, and they show up for this day?
It's mostly that we need this, we want this, and we are so happy to see these people here. We're glad to see them, we respect them.
Right.
We think they're wonderful artists, and the fact that they're here at all is something, means something to us. We're happy to see them. I can't think of anybody I saw that day whom I didn't like, or whom I didn't think was a wonderful person. And they were wonderful people. I like stars. I like being around stars. I have all my life, and I'm 73 years old now. I still do. I can remember going to the Atlanta airport to meet, I think, Paul Newman, Anthony Franciosa, and an actor named Virgil Fry, whom I didn't know well, who were coming to go to Gadsden, Alabama to appear at a rally. And Houston airports used to be able to walk up to the plane and get the people as they came up. So I went to see these movie stars whom I was crazy about. And after they stepped off the plane, the governor of Alabama, George Wallace, stepped off behind them. And the crowd at the bottom of the plane came to him, all to him. He was the attraction. He was the big person in this group. And so we decided to go on to Gaston and see them when they were appearing at this rally. And I drove over there with some people from SNCC. And as I was leaving Gaston, a car stopped us with 5 white men in it in plainclothes, which is nervous-making. Right. And the guy said to me, he said, "Whose car is this?" And I said, "Belongs to James Foreman, who's the head of SNCC." He said, "Where is he?" I said, "I don't know." He said, "He's in Chicago, isn't he?" I said, "Yeah, he is." So we determined that we would spend the night in Gaston instead of trying to go down the highway. Next morning, we're eating breakfast in a little black cafe. These 2 black guys are sitting at the next table, and one of them said, "We saw you last night." He said, "But you had nothing to worry about. We were sitting in the bushes with some shotguns. If anything had happened, we had you covered." I said, "Oh my God." But anyway, we love celebrities. We were happy to see them. The first time I ran for Congress, Harry Belafonte came to Atlanta to appear at the Fox Theater, I think, and we importuned him to come to a rally for me in a public housing project. Passed out leaflets. Harry Belafonte is going to be here. Came there in the morning, about 8 in the morning. No, but not a soul. Not a soul to be seen. I said, "Oh my Lord, I got this great guy here. Nobody here." I had a loudspeaker. I said, "Come meet Harry Belafonte." Thousands of people. It was the kickoff of my campaign, and I won like nobody's business. Thank you, Harry.
As the speech is starting that day, as Dr. King's speech is starting, are you able to really focus on it? Are you able to actually listen to it, or is there so much going on that it's only maybe after the fact that you really were able to sit and listen to the words?
Well, there are 2 things. First of all, before Dr. King got up to speak, a reporter from AP who recognized me as I had this opprobrious moniker of being Dr. King's New York lawyer. So they recognized me, and they said, "Mr. Jones, we just got word over the wire services that Dr. W.E. Du Bois has just died in Ghana within the past hour. And don't you think that the people here ought to know about this?" And I said, "Yes, I do." So I took a March program, and I wrote a note, "Dear Martin, just got word from AP that Dr. Du Bois died in Ghana." And I folded it, and it was relayed up to him till he finally looked at it, got it, and he handed it to, I think Roy Wilkins made the announcement, but I thought how profound that was, that on that very day, where approximately 300,000 people had come together at the foot of the Lincoln memorial, the largest gathering of black and white people in the United States as of that date, as of that time, that one of the great icons of African American history should pass away.
Clarence, I think it was A. Philip Randolph who made the announcement, because I can remember him saying
Okay,
in that
correct me.
stentorian voice,
Right.
that great voice from Tallahassee, Florida, with that British accent. He said, it is his voice that is calling us here today.
And I tear up when I think about it now, all these years since. But I'm sure it was A. Philip Randolph who did that.
Right.
The story goes that, so he's reading his speech, and the story goes that Mahalia Jackson says something. Says, tell him about, I'm paraphrasing, as I've read, tell him about the dream.
You can hear her on the tape. Tell him about the dream, Martin. Tell him about the dream. You can hear her say that.
Did he hear her?
He had to, she was right over here. She's as far away as Clarence is from me. You can see her on the video.
When Mahalia speaks, you can hear.
Yeah.
I was standing 50 feet behind Dr. King when he was delivering his speech. And I heard her shout to him, tell him about the dream, Martin. Now, what I saw him do is that this is all happening in real time. Right. He takes the written text, he slides it to the left side of the lectern, grabs the lectern, looks out. All this is all happening in real time. And I turned to whoever was standing next to me, and I said, these people out there, they don't know it, but they're about ready to go to church. Because I saw Dr. King's body language change. So that the speech that everybody celebrates as the I Have a Dream speech, okay, that speech was spoken spontaneously and extemporaneously. And it's only the first part of the speech we was reading, but after Mahalia Jackson said, tell about the dream, that we spoke spontaneously and extemporaneously. And the latter part of the speech, he referred to some notes about Negro preacher, free at last, but the speech was extemporaneous. Now, the most extraordinary thing about Martin Luther King Jr., putting it in contemporary times, is that he could mentally cut and paste in real time. You know? He could be speaking extemporaneously. And if you had listened to him speaking a lot of time, you would see that without skipping a beat, he would insert things from speeches he had made before seamlessly. And it was powerful. And
did you know how powerful? Can you get it in that moment of what it became, arguably the greatest speech in American history?
I didn't know at the time, but I'd heard him speak many times, and I heard him once at a rally in Atlanta where we had announced a cessation of protest that wasn't popular with everybody, and there was unrest in the crowd, and somebody called his father and Uncle Tom, which is just awful. And Dr. King came in the back of the church and came to the pulpit, and he lifted the crowd up, and he left them down. And he lifted them up, and he let them down. And he lifted them up, and he let them down. And we all went home happy.
As is the case with most Baptist preachers. But I think Dr. King had an inordinate relationship to his constituency. He could read his audience, and sometimes you could tell when he was just bone weary, because sometimes he was delivering 2 and 3 and 4 speeches a day and doing things, and you could tell when fatigue had set in. And I think at one moment, in reading this vast crowd that stood before him, he did not feel that he had quite gotten to that cadence, to that place that Baptist instinct was at play. And I think it was then that Mahalia, who was very much of the church, could sense what he was sensing. And I think her instructing him or appealing to him to tell him about the dream, Martin, was a way to tell him, go to where you're best. Go to your Baptist moment. Go to your preacher moment. And without, as Clarence just said, missing a beat, he just segued right into the moment. because many of us had heard him say before, "I have a dream." That was not the first time he'd ever said that.
And then one of the most extraordinary things, you hear a little bit of it on the tape, but if you were there, was the feedback from the audience. Now, I would be with Dr. King several times when his father, affectionately known as Daddy King, and Dr. King would be preaching, and Daddy King would lean back and say, "Make it plain, Martin, make it plain, make it plain." And when Dr. King was speaking at the March on Washington, I was standing behind him, but I could hear this refrain, "Well, yes, amen, well, yes, doctor, yes." I could hear all this. And I think it was this feedback between from the audience. And as I've written, I said, I saw him speak many times. I had never heard him speak that way, ever before or ever since. It was as if some cosmic force came down and took over this man. Same body, same person. But it was extraordinary, just extraordinary.
Before we get to your questions here, the feeling that night, as the crowd disperses, you do a show on CBS with some of the other people who had come, Brando and Charlton Heston, James Baldwin also. And in the days after the march, is there a sense of, like a knowing sense that of the elation of what the march, and that it succeeded and was wonderful, and yet the war still going on out there, and 3-4 weeks later, the 4 girls in Birmingham are killed?
I think that most of us who were at that march were more than fulfilled that the mission that we had set for ourselves had been achieved. It certainly was a great awakening for the Kennedy family. By that I mean most of his administration. I think that Bobby Kennedy, who was the Attorney General, and all those who lived in the shadow of this expectation of mayhem were hugely relieved that not only did the day go so well, but Dr. King delivered a message that gave him a lot of political room to maneuver thereafter. I think in many ways Barack Obama has instructed the peoples of America to become involved, to become engaged, to let their voice be heard. That nowhere had America's voice been heard as clearly and was demonstrated as clearly as the almost 300,000 people who gathered there that day. That was a big slice of America, a big look at what America was really about. It just had touched all of the important points. And I think the elation that we all felt thereafter was that we had set a goal, we had achieved it, but I don't think any of us had any illusions about the fact that the enemy is going to slink off and retreat into some quiet, removed places, feeling defeated. As a matter of fact, our worst fears were fulfilled by all the mayhem that came right after that, right after the march. The little girls from Birmingham and all those things. White America, that part of white America that holds race so close to its menu and its appetite, was fully demonstrated thereafter. And the only other time that I've seen that kind of race characteristic in the American theme is what I'm looking at now at the Tea Party and the way in which a shift has taken place with certain people in our country who are never going to ever settle for the issue of race, who are never going to accept that black people have a place that's rightfully human and that we're all God's children. They're just not going to accept it.
I drove home. I'm sorry,
This,
Eric.
I'm just going to finish right up. This period that we're in right now gives me an edge and a sense that the worst that's in us is yet to be displayed. And I had that edge in the days right after the march.
I was going to say, I drove home back to Atlanta right after the march, and we had no idea of the magnitude of the crowd. You could look out from where we were standing or sitting and see this enormous number of people. We had no idea how many were there. And the next morning, the newspapers reported 250,000, an enormous number, the biggest ever gathered in Washington for one of these kind of protests. And I knew then that I'd been to something important. And I should have said when I was reading that list of things that it comes from a book called The Bystander by Nick Bryant about President Kennedy.
Before we get to your questions, we have some special guests in the audience tonight. First of all, I'd like to introduce Mayor, this is true, the only man in New York City, person in New York City who I allowed to call me Buddy. The former mayor of New York City, Mayor David Dinkins. And it's still okay, Mayor. Buddy is okay. The rest of you? And we are also joined by members of the extended families of the 3 civil rights workers who were killed in Mississippi in 1964. The families of Andrew Goodman, James Chaney, and Michael Schwerner. And we are joined tonight amongst the extended family by Annie's brother David, James Chaney's sister Julia Chaney Moss, and Mickey Schwerner's brother Steve Schwerner. Thank you all for being here. I apologize in advance that I don't believe we'll get to every single one of the questions, but we'll get to as many as possible. I'm sorry I can't read the young person's name. I am in the 11th grade. I currently attend a public school in South Bronx. What is the difference between back then and now? Do you still think there is more to be done?
That's a great question. There's so much more to be done, we can't even think of what it is. I mean, it's so great. You know, it's so odd because America has come from here to here and made all these positive steps, but we need to go from here to here and make other steps. So yes, there's much more to be done.
Next question, what is your...
I had to add something to that,
Sure.
if you don't mind. It's this. I don't think the idea of democracy and the experiment in trying to perfect that system will ever come to a time when there will be anything other than an ebb and tide. There are always going to be these great movements that move civilization forward. And then you go into a period when the evil among us begins to appear again and exercise itself, and all of a sudden you find yourself back at the same game. We seem to get it a little bit better each time we move forward. But I would have to say that having lived most of the 20th century, I am now 86 years old, and I remember when I was looking at people who were 86 when I was 30, that I would never fall prey to all of the things that people at my age fall prey to. And what wishful thinking there, boy. But I just think that always in America, as long as you have the capacity for groups like the Tea Party to emerge, for inordinate, vulgar sums of money to be amassed, and people can spread it around to buy the political process and do what's going to do, America will forever be challenged to maintain a democratic society and to maintain a democratic point of view.
I agree with that. Yeah.
This question says, many people feel the generation which followed the civil rights movement have not continued the struggle. Schools have resegregated. Prison populations soar. People of color face oppression. Do you think we have failed to pass the baton?
Oh, that's a very good question. First of all, in terms of the person I knew best, but I also knew others, of course, but in terms of Martin Luther King Jr., I mean, he, of course, was sui generis, one of a kind. But in direct response to your question, there have been, in my opinion, some deficiencies in the subsequent generation of leadership, the current generation and generation immediate of leadership following 1963, for example. We have in the African American community a generation of young men and women. They've achieved significant education, many of them. People in the entertainment industry have achieved a significant amount of stature. But I don't think that they have, that generation, with some notable exceptions, so I'm not going to make a blanket, but as a general rule, they haven't exercised the kind of leadership that I thought would be most commensurate with the leadership that was exhibited in the 1963. So let me just make a personal example. Not me personally, but I want to talk to my elder here.
Don't you forget it.
No. I'm just 3 years, just a little 3.5 years behind you, my brother. So.
And
It'll
let me just
never
interject.
change.
Julian, you were about 6 or 7
Yes,
years of age when. Okay.
Well, the truth is, there's no modern equivalent of this man.
Well, this is just the point.
There's nobody does or did what this man did.
Julian, this is just the point.
No one.
That's just the point I wanted to make.
It may be too much to expect someone to have come near to or equaled his commitment to social justice. I don't think you look, not just in the entertainment world, but look in the larger world, and you don't see anybody like this man.
Okay, he said it.
And we're weaker because of it. But I think you could go back in time and say, where's the W.B. Du Bois? Where is the W.E.B. Du Bois? Where is the Martin King? Where is the
Paul Robeson?
Yes, where's the Paul Robeson? Maybe we don't have to have these people, but it sure would be a help.
See, I think there's one point that has to be made, and it's this. This country, 50 years ago, even as far back as 60 years ago, really was in the hands of the young. There was a large number of young men and women that came together to make the decisions that were made. If I remember correctly, I think you were about 19 or 20.
20.
When I first met you. And I was the elder of the group.
Yeah,
that's right.
All of them. Dr. King was 24 years old when he first stepped into the fray. I was 26, 2 years older than him. And when you look around at John Lewis and all the people we have mentioned, Clarence here as well, we were all very young. I had just come to my own space as a maturing artist. And we had to strategize. We had to sit and make up the rules. We had no power sitting in the Congress. We had no power sitting in the halls of justice. We had no power sitting in the executive branch. We had no power sitting in the courts of America, except a handful of men like Justice William O. Douglas, who made up the Supreme Court and the Warren Court that gave us room to work with. And the genius of these young people pulling together, making this up every day as they went along, looking at targets, looking at destinations. It was an incredible feat. And what we did in that period was not one mission that we set for ourselves in the civil rights movement did we ever fail. We won every one of them. What we did not do, and would have been almost impossible to do, we did not have the sophistication on what to do after we had achieved the goals that we had won. Not just Julian, but John Lewis and so many others were encouraged to run for political office, because now we had won this phase of the battle. The next thing was, how would we fill the halls of Congress? How would we now fill these new spaces that we had won for ourselves? And by the time we identified who was the most capable of representing us politically, we had cleaned out the leadership of the civil rights movement. They were all retired to the halls of Congress and into state legislators, and they went on to another level of function. That left the plantation somewhat fallow. Nobody stepped in to become the Julian Bond of that time. And we just used up our harvest. And I don't think that it was some slight or some miscarriage and not very bright of us and not very thoughtful. We just strained the game. We took the best shot we had with the best people, most of whom led the movement, who are now going off to become legislators and writing the laws, and still are. The reason that John Lewis is not here tonight is because he understands the importance of that vote he has to make tonight to be in Washington. Just one last, and I'll leave it alone. Civil rights movement has not failed to pass the baton. We didn't fail to pass the baton. America failed to pass the baton. It isn't just us. Where are the white voices? Where are the other cultures? Where are the other people that make up the grand American mosaic? Where are their voices in this space? We who had the burden of the civil rights movement gave our best shot. Who filled that void once we went on to do the things we were required to do?
I was to say, just to put it into historic perspective, August 28, 1963, Dr. King was 34 years of age. Okay? 34 years of age. I was 32. And many of, I think Harry said it best, is that America has failed to pass the baton. I think that's a good way of saying it.
This is a question that we could no doubt spend hours discussing, but we'll try and keep it brief so we can get to some other questions. What is your perspective on the Trayvon Martin case?
Well, I think like most people, a great miscarriage occurred. It's clear to me that murder was done, but murder was not prosecuted, and the murderer got away. And the family is left without one of their sons, and the wrong that occurred not only in the killing, but the wrong in the law that allowed the killing to occur has yet to be corrected, and may not be corrected, although there are many people working hard to correct it. It's not been corrected yet, and I'm not really sure if it's going to be corrected anytime soon, but it badly needs to be.
The tragedy of the Trayvon Martin case is that Trayvon Martin was a young black man in America at the wrong place and the wrong time, and that he was killed, no matter what other niceties that occurred. He was killed primarily because he was a young black man.
A few more questions.
And I must just add to that, that the Trayvon Martin case, as much as that has been displayed and debated, is is also part of another view of the American process, was the fact that the greatest seat of justice should have betrayed the black movement by what the Supreme Court did in reversing the Civil Rights Act for the right to vote. Zimmerman may have killed one black child, but the Supreme Court has ensured the death of tens of thousands
Go ahead.
by us not getting
Preach. Go
the
ahead.
right to vote.
This comes from a fourth grade student. It says, "What does it feel like to know you made a difference?"
Well, there's a fable, whoever this fourth grade student is, that goes like this, is that if the surviving lions don't tell their stories, the hunters will get all the credit. So I feel that I have been providentially blessed to be the accidental, gratuitous beneficiary of temporary longevity. And that I don't believe that there is anything I could have done in my life looking back that would have equaled or surpassed anything I could have done working with that extraordinary man, Martin Luther King Jr.
When I was in the Georgia legislature, I used to go in the Marriott in downtown Atlanta. It was open all night, had an all-night restaurant. Got to know one of the waitresses there, a white woman. And one day she complained to me that she wanted to adopt a child, but she was single, and Georgia didn't allow single people to adopt children. And so I passed a law that allowed her to adopt a child. And I never saw anybody as happy as this woman was. It was a great feeling of something, and I did it. I did it.
Right.
I did it. Made me feel good.
It's an interesting question. What were the adverse effects on your families due to your work in the civil rights movement? How do they see those accomplishments today?
I have 5 kids. I was away from my children more often than I should have been. But I think, at least I hope, and they tell me they understood. And I'll see them this weekend. And I'll say, "Everything's okay, isn't it?" They'll say, "Yeah, it's okay, Dad." So it's just rough to be involved in civic affairs and not lose something of yourself, I think. You give up something in order to do something, but if you're committed to it, you feel you must, you have to do it, and you do.
I think my children paid a price for my celebrity. There's a lot about that taunted them and misappropriated the truth in terms of the choices that they could make and the selections that were offered them. But my daughter Gina, who's here tonight, she worked with me on a film called Sing Your Song, which is a documentary on the history of that. And I walked in one day during an intense period of editing, and I walked in and I saw her very teary. And I thought it was just an expression of her fatigue and being up so long and trying to meet the schedules for the release of the film. And when I said, "What's going on, Gina?" And she said, "I just really never really understood, and I really never knew until I started to interview and talk to all of these people about what a commitment the people in that movement had to make in order for that movement to realize the victories and the goals that had been set. And we did pay a big price for not only in those who were lost to death and those who were crippled and maimed by the violence they experienced, but in the simple everyday tempos of life. I didn't realize how often my family had some anxiety that we were off somewhere and not knowing whether or not we were going to come home or not, or what was going on. And I'm just pleased to see that their children, my grandchildren, are now the beneficiaries of how they interpret that period of their lives to their children. And for that fact, I feel really rewarded. There's come a clarity and an understanding. But it's the sacrifice doesn't always appear as easily as one would suspect.
Is there, as we start to wind up, there's clear moral clarity on that day, on the March of Washington? You're a few months after Bull Connor, and there's clear moral clarity there in terms of right and wrong on that day. As the years of the 60s progress, it seems, looking back on it, that things got more nuanced, that the issues became somewhat murkier in terms of they weren't quite so black and white. Was there a longing as you continued the struggle and went into government and so on, was there a longing for like the moral clarity of that particular day?
Well, yes. I mean, there's a longing for a moral clarity, but there's nothing obscure or confusing about the clarity of the moral direction, the moral compass that Dr. King set, for example. He was America's 20th century quintessential apostle of nonviolence, okay? Committed to nonviolence and to the pursuit of personal excellence. And I think that one of the most troubling things for me in terms of the immorality of things that are taking place in the society is the existential presence of violence. It's like violence lies like molten lava beneath the surface of our society, just waiting to erupt. And I listened to the president speaking at the memorial service after the Naval Yard shooting, and he says, we've had these mass shootings, and are we arriving at a place where there's a new normal? A new normal where we can expect these things to occur. So I'm thinking to myself, get on out of here. I'm thinking to myself, this is 2013. And I thought about Dr. King, and I thought about the NRA and so forth. And I said, this whole question about guns and violence is not a Second Amendment question. It's background checks is important and all of that, but it's really not a Second Amendment question that the NRA would like us to be trapped into. It's a Sixth Commandment question. Thou shalt not murder. That's the issue.
The power of the civil rights movement wasn't so much that we were politically astute and knew all the right moves to make. As a matter of fact, there are a lot of politically dumb moves that we had made. Mm-hmm. What was the center to the movement, and is central now, even in today's discourse on life and decisions that have to be made, is that there was great moral clarity on the part of Dr. King and many who engaged in the campaign. Dr. King said, politics without morality is the politics of tyranny. And each time something was to be done and there was a question, the first thing Dr. King would refer to is, what is its moral consequence?
Right.
And if you measure everything you do by its moral consequence, more often than not, you come up with the answer in favor of what is morally correct. That's what is absent in the politics of today, not just in America, globally. There are no moral visionaries. There's no moral force that's at work taking the high ground on the decisions that have to be made. And nowhere was morality more in need in the decision-making process than is evident now.
I would ask you each in closing. I would ask you each in closing for one final thought, one final moment, an anecdote, a vignette of an interaction with Dr. King, away from the limelight, away from a personal moment, succinctly, I would hope, that you still carry with you to this day.
You know, I'm the only person in this room who can honestly say I was a student of Dr. King's. Dr. King taught one class, one time, 8 people in the class. I'm one of the 8. So if you're not one of the 8 and you say you were a student, you're lying. After class one day, he and I were walking across the Morehouse campus, and I said, Doc, his friends called him Doc. I said, Doc, how you doing? He said, Julian, I don't feel well. He said, unemployment is high, racism's everywhere, segregation is immovable. I feel awful, he said. I have a nightmare. I said, Doc, turn that around, try, I have a dream. And, well, remember, my word is my bond.
Who would like to go next? Clarence?
Oh, I remember being in Albany, Georgia in 1962 with Dr. King, and things had not been going well. And we were sharing a room and getting undressed about 12:30 late. And we were talking about several things, and we were talking about a very close colleague of ours, Stanley Levison, who was one of his closest advisors and a very dear friend of mine. And I had my back to Dr. King as I was taking off his shirt. And he said, you know, Clarence, you and Stanley are like wintertime soldiers. And I didn't quite understand what he was getting at. And as I was about ready to ask him a question, he said, anybody can stand with you in the warm sunlight of an August summer, but only a wintertime soldier stands with you in the alpine chill of winter. So I began to choke up a little, and I said, well, that certainly describes Stanley Levison. That doesn't describe me, Martin. But I never forgot that. I never forgot that that's the way he felt about that particular man, and I just happened to be the derivative beneficiary. I guess he wanted to include me, but I don't think I was quite worthy of it at that time.
I will leave the last word to you.
What's the question? You know, I just came back from Dublin. Amnesty International had its international convention, and I went there to be a participant and to be celebrated. But what struck me was that a reporter asked me at what time in my life as an artist did I become an activist. And I said to him, well, I can't answer that question because it's misappropriated. I was always an activist. I was an activist who became an artist. And in that choice, I am continually rewarded by the validation that people bring in any discourse that we may have on the subject of violence or nonviolence or black or white. The idea that what we did and the way in which we did it still is very clearly the best choice that people have for dealing with many of the human issues that we face. And to know that the choices that we made when we were put upon to make choices were historically now viewed as the correct ones. And that validation in itself makes me smile every day. I don't really need anything on a tombstone, except that if anybody should look at me, they'll say that that I could not be charged with patriotic treason.
Well, we all stand on the shoulders of so many family, friends, and people whose work and courage we admire. And you three gentlemen, we thank you for a lifetime of great choices, of courage, and we thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you. Thank you.